Hey everybody, I'm Logan Camden,
I'm Carson Breber.
and this is Nerd Sesh.
No! Oh my God! How could he do that?
Are you on What?
Charles Darwin.
Make sure to give us a follow on Twitter at nerd_session, on Instagram at nerdsesh, and for every episode of Nerd Session Hoop Nerds, check us out on YouTube at Nerd Sesh.
All right, so today we are going to be ranking our top 10 running backs of all time. We did this with point guards just a couple episodes ago, and we can't get enough of the lists. So, Logan, who do you have at number 10?
I have to say, so far with the list that we've done, with the rankings that we've done, this might have been the toughest one. There are so many good running backs.
So hard.
And even guys such as, that are not going to make my honorable mentions even, guys like Amon Green or Arian Foster, you just look at the running backs through the league's history, and there are so many good ones that had one good year or two good years that you have to leave off, but were dominant, and you remember them like they were all-time greats.
Yeah, and even, taking out the guys you have to exclude, within the top 10, there were two specific stretches of three guys that I'll talk about later that I kept going back and forth with. It's a tough list. There's a lot of great players to choose from.
Well, to kick us off, my number 10 is Earl Campbell.
Okay, so for all the conflict we just discussed, we actually agree. I have Earl Campbell at 10 as well.
So some numbers for Earl Campbell. He is a Hall of Famer, 9,407 yards on his career, 37th all-time, 74 touchdowns, 26th all-time, a five-time Pro Bowler, a one-time MVP in 1979, a three-time Offensive Player of the Year, three-time All-Pro selection, 5 1,000-yard seasons, a three-time league leader in rushing yards in 8 seasons. Now, Earl Campbell, the reason that he is at number 10 on my list is the all-time numbers aren't going to blow anybody away, but his stretch of dominance was comparable to anybody in the league's history, in my opinion.
Could not agree more. You mentioned he had 5 seasons with 1,000 yards. He had 5 seasons with 1,300 yards, and that's in only 8 seasons in the league. You had a lot of great facts, but just to give you the first 3 years of his career, these were his averages per season: 1,694 yards, 15 touchdowns, and 4.9 yards per carry. He's 14th all-time in rushing yards per game. Did not quite have the longevity, but an MVP, 3 All-Pro selections, and one of the best stretches in history. He's got to be on the list.
And while we're on the topic of Earl Campbell, who can forget that one amazing run where he's getting the jersey just taken off of him and he's fighting through all kinds of defenders? Earl Campbell, a tough as nails running back, and you would love to have him on your team.
Absolutely. Now, who do you have at number 9?
All right, Carson. So at number 9 for me, I have Eric Dickerson. And Eric Dickerson was really hard to rank for me because of, most importantly, the 2,000-yard season. I didn't really know where to go with this one. Some numbers for Eric Dickerson: a Hall of Famer, 13,259 yards, 9th all-time, 90 touchdowns, 13th all-time, a 6-time Pro Bowl selection, 5-time All-Pro selection, 7,000-yard seasons, and, of course, the 2,000-yard season I mentioned in 1984, a 4-time league leader in rushing yards, and in 11 seasons. Who is your number 9?
My number 9 is a guy that I had at number 7 for a while. I ended up moving him down because he did not quite have the longevity. My number 9 is O.J. Simpson. Obviously, taking the off-the-field stuff, which is potentially horrific, he very well may have killed 2 people, out of the equation. O.J. had one of the best peaks ever. 6-time Pro Bowler, 5 All-Pro appearances, an MVP. His 11,236 yards is still 21st, 61 rushing touchdowns in his career, 4.7 yards per carry, 83.2 yards per game is 12th. And here's what makes him stand out to me. He's a four-time yards leader, 2-time touchdown leader, 3-time yards from scrimmage leader. He averaged 107 or more yards per game in 3 different seasons in that 1973 season. You mentioned Eric Dickerson, of course, is the single-season rushing leader, but O.J. Simpson had 2,003 yards in 14 games, 12 touchdowns that season, and 6 yards per carry, 143 yards per game. One of the most efficient and dominant rushers ever. 5 1,100-plus yard seasons, and his 5-year prime averages. Yes, go ahead.
Well, you know what's funny is I think you look at Eric Dickerson and O.J. Simpson, and the numbers all time in their single season, such as the league leading numbers, are very comparable.
Very similar. Dickerson just has more longevity. You're talking about Dickerson has 13,259 yards. That's 9th all time, whereas OJ's 21st. Dickerson has the 90 touchdowns, 13th all time. OJ has just 61, 46th all time. So I agree, very similar, but Dickerson did it for a little bit longer.
Well, it's funny. You can also say that they were the best running back in the NFL for 4 seasons. If they led the league in rushing yards, you can always make that case. And both of them led the league in rushing yards 4 times. The reason that OJ is higher for me, OJ has the MVP.
Okay, well, that's an interesting case. To me, I don't know how much value you can put in the MVP because almost all the guys have MVPs, actually. Dickerson, I believe, is the only guy on my list that doesn't have an MVP, but just an all-time great runner who did it for a while. I will not take any offense with the OJ selection. As I said, I had him higher for a while, but I realized, okay, here, let me give you the 5-year prime numbers because this is what is so compelling. He averaged 1,540 yards, 9 touchdowns, and 5.1 yards per carry. That's in 14-game seasons. You extrapolate that to 16-game seasons. Those are averages of 1,759 yards, 10.3 touchdowns per year. That's a top 3 or 4 peak of all time. But he was really only a very good running back for 5 seasons. He had one of the more dramatic rises and drop-offs of anyone on this list. And that's why I can't put him higher.
I agree with some of your argument. The peak was short, but it was very high. Let's move on to number 8. Who do you have?
At number 8, I have Marshall Faulk.
Wow. That's just shocking to me. I think you were undervaluing Marshall Faulk extremely.
Okay.
Number 8 for me is LaDainian Tomlinson.
Okay, well, this is a great debate to have because I have Tomlinson at 7. Why would you have Marshall Faulk above LaDainian Tomlinson?
Marshall Faulk won a Super Bowl. He was a tremendous receiving back and running back. The Super Bowl for me does it, as well as the numbers are comparable. And Faulk has an MVP. I mean, they both do. Excuse me.
Does LaDainian.
Excuse me. Yeah, sorry. Said the wrong thing. Faulk has the Super Bowl, and it's tough because LaDainian was on some really good San Diego Charger teams. One that I believe got to the AFC Championship against the New England Patriots, if I'm not mistaken, and that was with Schottenheimer. It may have been the divisional round. I'm getting stuff mixed up. They almost won that game. Tom Brady threw an interception with about 30 seconds left, if I'm not mistaken, and the Chargers cornerback, instead of going down, chose to run with the football and try to make a play when they didn't need it. Yeah. Fumbles the ball. Patriots get it back.
Brutal.
They kick a game winner. You can't put that on LaDainian. But LaDainian was on some really good teams, but Marshall Faulk has the Super Bowl ring, and that is why I have Faulk above Tomlinson.
Well, Marshall Faulk also had a 2-time MVP winning quarterback with him. So here's the thing if you're looking at Tomlinson, 5 Pro Bowls, 3 All-Pros, and an MVP. Marshall Faulk, 7 Pro Bowls, 3 All-Pros, and an MVP. But if we're looking at the career numbers, for Tomlinson, 13,684 rushing yards is 6th all-time. Marshall Faulk, 12,279 is 12th. 145 rushing touchdowns for Tomlinson is 2nd all-time. 100 touchdowns for Faulk is 8th. They both average 4.3 yards per carry, and I know what you're thinking. The yards from scrimmage is the difference maker. Marshall Faulk is the best receiving back ever. 6,875 receiving yards and 36 receiving touchdowns for a total of 136 rushing receiving touchdowns, which is 4th among running backs, and over 19,000 yards from scrimmage, which is 3rd among running backs. But LaDainian Tomlinson is a very underrated receiving back all time. He has 18,456 yards from scrimmage, so he is very much in the same realm as Faulk, thanks to 4,770 receiving yards, so he's 5th all time among running backs. He's 2 spots behind Faulk when it comes to yards from scrimmage. He was a 2-time leader in yards, 3-time leader in touchdowns, had 3 seasons with 2,000 or more yards from scrimmage, and of course he had that 2006 season where he had an NFL record 28 rushing touchdowns, and in his first 8 years in the league, LaDainian Tomlinson averaged 1,470 yards, 15.8 touchdowns, and 4.4 yards per carry. I mean, are you kidding me? That is the majority of a career those were his averages.
Well, if there's anything that you could put down about Marshall Faulk, it's probably the fact that he never led the league in rushing yards a single year. That's the only bash I think you can have on a guy like Marshall Faulk.
I have one more bash. The playoff numbers. 12 playoff games in his career, only 50.2 yards per game, 6 touchdowns, 3.6 yards per carry, and only 43 receiving yards per game.
And no Super Bowls for LaDainian Tomlinson. Anyway, Marshall Faulk, 700.
But when Faulk had the chance to perform, he didn't do it. The team critique is not on LaDainian.
But you're going to put it down for Marshall Faulk? I don't understand.
If Cedric Maxwell won a championship, if Cedric Maxwell won a championship and Magic Johnson didn't that year, and actually that's not even a good example because Cedric Maxwell was good in the playoffs. If Larry Siegfried won a championship one year, you see what I'm saying? If you underperform in the big spots, your mere association with that team doesn't give you more credit than a guy who was just because he didn't have the opportunity.
I think this is where we have to draw the line again with the where do we value team success with a non-quarterback, and I do. Evidently, you don't as much as me.
I think that's true.
For Falk, 767 catches in his career. For a running back, that's unreal. 6,875 receiving yards with only 36 touchdowns, but still very good. Falk, 12 seasons, 11 with 1,000 scrimmage yards. And I don't have any problem with you saying that Tomlinson maybe should be higher because I honestly tossed and turned. It was very hard. Tomlinson was a 2-time league leader in rushing yards in a cutthroat era for running the football. Sean Alexander, Priest Holmes, Larry Johnson, they're all running over the league. And a guy like Tomlinson is right up there with them and performing better than them. The Super Bowl. And that's honestly the only point that I have on him. And again, you don't value the Super Bowl as much, so I understand. But Falk was multidimensional, and I'm not saying Tomlinson wasn't. He was a decent receiving back. Falk was multidimensional and had more team success.
Almost 5,000 receiving yards for his career. That's pretty good. I mean, he was basically Falk's equal in yards from scrimmage. And if you're thinking Marshall Falk has one advantage over people, it's scrimmage yards, not really over Tomlinson. And then Tomlinson is maybe the best ever at getting into the end zone.
So if we're going to put this on the table about team success, what about offensive lines? Because I think that, don't get me wrong.
That'll come up later very much with a certain Emmitt Smith.
I agree. Marshall Falk ran behind he ran behind Orlando Pace.
Yeah.
The rest of the offensive line I couldn't name. Tomlinson ran behind some very good San Diego Charger offensive lines. Are we going to put him down for that at all?
I mean, I'm pretty sure those Rams O-lines were pretty good. You have to be if you're operating with one of the greatest offenses of all time, period.
Do you not consider that Chargers offense to be an all-time great offense?
Yeah, well, not on the same level as the greatest show on turf.
Really, because I think you can make the case. I genuinely do.
I mean, okay.
Phillip Rivers, Lorenzo Neal, LaDainian Tomlinson, Nick Hardwick, Antonio Gates, Vincent Jackson. Yeah, that sounds pretty good to me.
That does sound pretty good. It doesn't sound as good to me as two-time MVP Kurt Warner, MVP
Bruce,
Marshall
Torrey
Falk,
Holt.
and Isaac Bruce and Torrey Holt. Isaac Bruce, who could rip off 1,800 yards in a season. But that's a debate for another day.
I think we're running in circles. We'll get a little more in depth on this debate because we're at a stalemate with the Super Bowl.
So who do you have at 7? I've already given my 7, but
7 is a man you've already mentioned, and that is O.J. Simpson for me.
Okay, and as I said, I had OJ at 7 above both LaDainian and Falk for a while, and then I looked at the total body of work and I realized I really wanted to value peak a lot in these lists because I think that's obviously indicative of how amazingly talented some of these guys are. But I realized when LaDainian Tomlinson is averaging 1,500 yards and 16 touchdowns for 8 years, I can't put OJ above him just because OJ had a slightly more brilliant peak but didn't do it for as long.
The reason that I have OJ higher than all of these other guys is he does have the MVP, which LaDainian has as well. He was uncontestedly the best running back in football for 5 straight seasons. And for a guy like LaDainian Tomlinson, I don't think you could say that.
I actually think I might disagree with that. Maybe not 5 years, but 3 or 4.
That's the reason I'm saying that OJ's above him, because at the back end, you had Sean Alexander nipping at his heels. You had Priest Holmes.
But here's the thing. If LaDainian Tomlinson is a great running back for another 5 years and O.J. Simpson is irrelevant for the rest of his career besides those 5 years, he's irrelevant. Look at the numbers. He had 5,000 yards.
You're just gonna do that to your boy?
Well, okay. He's not my boy. He's not my boy. He is a Buffalo Bill, and I love him for it. But he never had his next best season was 742 yards and 5 touchdowns. I'm sorry.
You didn't let me finish my point. Okay. And on the other side, you had Adrian Peterson.
Yeah. Okay. that was the hammer?
Yeah, sorry. Adrian Peterson was on the other side. I think OJ, did you already run down his numbers?
Yeah, I did.
Okay, well, you've already heard the OJ case, and I get it. I get why you're saying this. He had 5 1,000-yard seasons. He had 6 without. The separator for me also with the OJ, LaDainian Tomlinson debate, OJ has a 2,000-yard season, as you said, in 14 games. That's pretty hard. LaDainian never had that 2,000-yard season.
He had the 28 touchdown season.
He did, and that was very impressive. But come on, a lot of them, and I'm not discrediting goal line touchdowns. They're important, but they were goal line touchdowns.
I'm not even going to try to argue against the O.J. Simpson peak. As I've said, it is top 3 or 4 all time. I gave you the 16-game equivalent numbers, 1,760 yards and 10 touchdowns with over 5 yards per carry. Unbelievable. Better than anything LaDainian Tomlinson ever did. It doesn't matter. Tomlinson was too good for too long, and O.J. wasn't.
It's funny as well because they both played 11 seasons, and you can compare the all-time numbers pretty well if they played a similar number of seasons. Neither of them had the team success either. It's kind of funny honestly a really similar career if you think about it.
Well, sorry, let me just give one number. LaDainian Tomlinson has basically 2.5 times the career touchdowns of O.J. Simpson. That says a lot.
Goal line touchdowns.
Okay, it doesn't matter.
What did he have? 146? It was a lot.
145. Second all time.
Yeah.
And 6th in all-time rushing yards. LaDainian Tomlinson, very underrated in my opinion. Who do you have next at 6?
6th, I have Adrian Peterson.
Okay, I have Eric Dickerson at 6. So you already touched on Dickerson. I'll give a brief little rundown. 4-time league leader in yards. Actually, I was surprised by how low you had Dickerson because he's 9th all-time in total yards. He's 13th all-time in total touchdowns. 90.8 yards per game is 5th all-time. He's a 4-time league leader in yards, a league leader in touchdowns, 4-time league leader in yards from scrimmage, 4 seasons with 2,000-plus yards from scrimmage, 7 1,200-plus seasons, 5 seasons averaging at least 100 yards per game, and of course the single-season yards record with 2,105 yards, 14 touchdowns, and 5.6 yards per carry, and the first 7-year averages, because I love doing this to show how dominant some of these guys were. 1,604 yards, 11.7 touchdowns, and 4.6 yards per carry.
You see, it's funny to me. I valued Peak a little higher on my list purely because you can look at the all-time numbers and be blown away by certain guys. Curtis Martin would be on my list if we were really valuing all-time numbers. John Riggins would be on my list if we were heavily valuing all-time numbers. Hell, Frank Gore would be on my list if we were heavily valuing all-time numbers. I think the peak value should be a little higher.
Okay, how 90.8 yards per game is 5th all-time. And that's not a cumulative metric. That's every game he went out there. He was unbelievable.
You're arguing the case for Eric Dickerson.
Correct.
Adrian Peterson has an MVP.
Adrian Peterson's higher on my list.
Okay.
We're really, you just have Marshall Faulk way higher than I do, is what this is coming down to.
Marshall Faulk's the next guy on my list. He's 5th.
Okay, so go ahead, run down the numbers for Adrian Peterson. I have him even higher.
Adrian Peterson's numbers, 13,343 yards, 8th all-time, 107 touchdowns, 5th all-time, 7 Pro Bowl selections, 4 All-Pro selections, a one-time MVP in 2012, 2,000-yard season. Moderate team success for Adrian Peterson. He played in the NFC Championship, no Super Bowl for him. Of course, Brett Favre throwing that soul-crushing interception to the New Orleans Saints. I believe it was Tracy Porter. 8 1,000-yard seasons for Adrian Peterson, 3 without. And I think it's a testament to Adrian Peterson to why you may have him higher. Look at what he did with the Washington Redskins just last season. That is impressive. And Washington, why aren't you giving him the ball? Give him the rock. He had 1,000 yards last year. We're not on that topic. Anyway, 3-time league leader in rushing yards in a cutthroat era for running backs, and he is currently in his 13th season.
Yeah, so I'll get into why I have Peterson so high in a minute, but I think that there's a serious case to be made for Adrian Peterson as, well, I won't say what number I have him. I don't want to spoil anything.
So, you know, it's funny. I think that if you have Peterson at 5th.
I didn't say that.
Well, if you do, I think the top 4 should be pretty definitive. And if you don't have Adrian Peterson 5th, I definitely want to hear what you're on.
Okay, I think you would like to hear. But you have Marshall Faulk next. Talk about Marshall Faulk a little since you love him so much.
It's the Super Bowl. It's the dual threat.
I mean,
I like Marshall Faulk.
The 1,000 season, it's stuff like that. I totally get it. He's the greatest receiving back ever. We'll see if he can hold that title, though, with this new generation.
Christian McCaffrey,
the
Saquon
Camaras.
Barkley.
Yeah, I mean, all those guys can catch up the backfield now.
Yeah, Marshall Faulk has a Super Bowl, and I still value Super Bowls for players. I think you have to that weren't quarterbacks. Why did I argue that L.C. Greenwood should be in the Hall of Fame? Why did I argue Donnie Shell should be in the Hall of Fame?
There is a level to that, though. You're talking about 4 Super Bowls versus a Super Bowl.
You are correct, but fine, let's get interesting. Did the St. Louis Rams win that Super Bowl without Marshall Faulk?
No, I don't think so.
Ha!
All right, great stuff. Are we ready to move on to my number 5?
Let's hear your number 5.
My number 5 is Emmitt Smith.
What?
Yeah. So here, let's talk about it. I went back and forth a lot between my numbers 3 to 5. Emmitt Smith is the greatest statistical running back ever if you're looking at totals. 8 Pro Bowls, 4 All-Pro selections, 3 Super Bowls, an MVP, a Super Bowl MVP. His 18,355 yards is first all-time. His 164 touchdowns is first all-time. He's a 4-time league leader in yards, a 3-time league leader in touchdowns. He had 11 1,000-yard seasons, 9 1,200-yard seasons, and he's the all-time great playoff rusher as well. 1,586 yards is the most rushing yards ever in the playoffs. 19 touchdowns is the most ever, and he averaged 93.3 yards per game and 4.5 yards per carry. Here are the reasons he isn't higher. 81.2 yards per game is only 16th all time. 4.2 yards per carry is obviously below average, especially by the standards of this list. He had an all-time great O-line in front of him. He protected his body by running out of bounds and avoiding contact, as we know, and therefore elongated his career in ways that these other running backs never did. And you, as a man who really appreciates the peak, should understand the fact that relative to the other guys in the top 5, Emmitt Smith's peak was not particularly high. He has the career numbers, but how many of these guys could have done what Emmitt Smith did behind that O-line and with that many years in the NFL? That, to me, is the issue. I moved Smith between 3 and 5. I said I was either going to have him at 3 or I'm going to have him at 5 because it's the same logic that would either be have him above the other 2 guys that I have in this tier, or he's going to be below both of them. He's either going to be above both of them or below both of them. Ultimately, I went with below.
You say his peak wasn't as high. Adrian Peterson led the league in rushing yards 3 times. Emmitt did it in 4.
Okay. Adrian Peterson, 13,343 yards is 8th all time. 107 touchdowns is 5th. 4.7 yards per carry is absolutely outstanding. How many guys have been able to do that? And has he ever had a great offensive line in his career? Remember when he ran for 2,000 yards? That O-line wasn't that good. He was absolutely amazing.
Before we get super in depth to this, I respect Los Cojones tú tienes to say this.
Thank you.
Okay? I respect that.
Thank you.
Because it's a good debate. I love Adrian Peterson.
Yeah.
It's hard not to. He's the greatest running back of our, I think, lifetime.
By far.
It's a tough case.
89 yards per game, 6th all time. Per pound, year for year, he has just been flat out better. And he's
Whoa.
Yes.
Slow your roll there, partner. Adrian Peterson.
You're telling me Adrian Peterson couldn't have done what Emmitt Smith did behind that line?
I'm not saying that. I'm saying that he didn't. Adrian Peterson wasn't alive then, dog.
But
we're not going to know.
But it doesn't matter because he's still 8th in yards, 5th in touchdowns, has more yards per carry, more yards per game.
And the only thing you can hold above Emmitt Smith's head with Adrian Peterson is maybe the 2,000-yard season.
No, that's not true at all. I just gave you the other things I can hold above him.
The
yards per carry, yards per game, the fact that he is still, by every metric, a top 8 running back of all time. If you're looking, if you're talking about individually between touchdowns and yards.
You're going with the yards per carry. Emmitt Smith has 3 Super Bowls and a Super Bowl MVP.
Yeah, I understand. I said he's the greatest playoff running back ever.
You, the playoff man, who in the point guards list broke out every point guard's playoff numbers.
NBA is different because they have such a larger sample size. I mean, you're talking about the difference between 17 games and hundreds of games.
Emmitt Smith and Adrian Peterson both have an MVP.
Yeah, I concur on this.
Emmitt Smith has 11,000-yard seasons, and he only has 4 without. His first as a rookie, in which he was short by, I believe, 63 yards. His last year in Dallas, and 2 in Arizona. The 2 in Arizona are kind of irrelevant.
Look, I have made my case. Those numbers are inflated because of the way that he played, the fact that he was able to elongate his career in the way that some of the greater running backs of all time were not willing to compromise their integrity as football players to do. And he was inefficient, yards per carry, and yards per game relative to the competition, and he had the greatest offensive line of any of these guys.
You are disrespecting. You were saying that maybe. I think the real thing that you're arguing is that he had a better offense than Adrian Peterson.
That's
You're going to give credit to guys like Troy Aikman and Michael Irvin. I don't think they win 3 Super Bowls without Emmitt Smith.
That's fine. Well, I actually disagree. I think that there are other running backs you could have put in that position that could have produced at a similar level.
Could have produced 18,000 yards and 164 touchdowns.
If you play for 100 years, you can do anything. You're the guy who hated on John Stockton for the cumulative numbers.
John Stockton never won a title.
That's true, but it's so different. Basketball and football are so different. You cannot compare winning between the two. You just can't.
The numbers are so similar, and the deciding factor is that Emmitt Smith's career numbers are better. He led the league in yards one more time, and he has 3 Super Bowls and a Super Bowl MVP. As you said, the best playoff running back of all time. If Adrian Peterson was such a good running back, how come he didn't lead his squad to the Super Bowl off his playoff numbers?
Because of the quarterbacks that he's had for his entire career and everyone around him. He had Brett Favre. Brett Favre was good for 1 year, and then he was bad for 1 other year, and that was it.
Yo, he did have Christian Ponder that 1 year, dog.
He's had Christian Ponder, Teddy Bridgewater, and Case Keenum, and before that, it was even uglier.
I disagree. I think you are on about something having Adrian Peterson above Emmitt Smith. I respect the case because I like Adrian Peterson, but you are completely discrediting Emmitt Smith.
It's a case of talent is what it comes down to. It's a case of that Adrian Peterson is half yards per carry better for your career is significant. Over basically 8 yards per game better for your career is significant. And the peak was higher.
No.
Yes.
I will argue that it wasn't.
How? How did Emmitt Smith ever do anything at the level of Adrian Peterson's 2,000-yard season?
You're arguing a single season over a longer...
I'm not.
That you just said the 2,000-yard season.
Well, yeah, because that's part of the peak. 2,097 yards, 6 yards per carry for an entire season, 12 touchdowns. He led the league in yards 3 times. Look, we're running in circles here. It's a fundamental disagreement on what makes a running back an all-time great. To me, Emmitt Smith was not as talented. He was not as efficient. And he just did it for longer. And so the raw numbers are bigger. We disagree on how you evaluate those guys. We're not gonna come to any understanding.
Based on your logic, a guy like Gale Sayers should make your list.
No, because Gale Sayers' numbers actually aren't that outstanding. He had like 2,000.
That 1 year he ran for a lot of yards.
He had like 2,000-yard seasons. You can't take my logic because here's what you're doing. This is a logical fallacy because that's the exact reason I had O.J. Simpson lower was because the prime wasn't as long. Adrian Peterson's prime has been long and he's been more efficient. He's just better.
Emmitt Smith again has 3 Super Bowl rings.
Okay.
That is why
we're
we'll fundamentally go higher than Adrian Peterson.
That's fine. Who do you have at number?
We don't even need. 4. Yeah, we need to go to 3. We just argued Peterson and Smith.
So you had Smith at 4.
I have Smith at 4.
Okay. Number 3. I think we're going to agree from this point on. Who do you have?
Walter Payton.
I have Walter Payton as well. Run down the numbers.
Nice change of pace.
That was nice.
Walter Payton, Hall of Famer, 16,726 yards, second all-time, 110 touchdowns, fourth all-time, a 9-time Pro Bowler, a 5-time All-Pro selection, 1-time MVP in 1977, a Super Bowl champ in 1985, 10,000-yard seasons, only 3 with less than 700, I believe. A 1-time league leader in rushing yards. That was surprising to me. Walter Payton was a monster, and in 13 seasons. And honestly, I wouldn't be mad if you made a case for any of the guys in the top 3 being your number 1. I honestly, for a little while, I debated having Walter Payton as my number 1.
Really? For me, my number 1 and 2 were the first thing when I thought of this list. It was so clear to me who I was going to have at 1 and who I was going to have at 2. But Walter Payton, absolutely outstanding. You already gave the career numbers. Also had over 21,000 yards from scrimmage, which is second among running backs. He had 10 seasons with 1,200 or more rushing yards, 4 seasons with 2,000 yards from scrimmage. He ran for 1,300 yards 10 seasons apart in 1976 and 1986, 86 as a 32-year-old. He was great for basically his entire career. To me, the difference between him and the top 2 guys were that the top 2 guys were never not great for a single moment in their careers.
You know, and screw Mike Ditka for not letting him score a touchdown in the Super Bowl.
Brutal. But here's the thing for me, and I get it if you don't want to talk about this, but Walter Payton and Adrian Peterson, to me, have very similar resumes, and that is the reason that I said I was going to have Smith above both of them or Smith below both of them.
You're such a clown.
I'm not a clown. Payton is second in yards. Peterson is 8th. Payton is 4th in touchdowns. Peterson is 5th. Peterson is 6th in yards per game. Payton is 7th. Those are very similar resumes.
Why are you pulling out the all-time numbers when Emmitt Smith's number 1?
Because I also brought up yards per game.
Moving on, we've got the number 2 and number 1 running backs. Carson, who is your number 2?
As I said, these were very easy for me. Number 2, I have Barry Sanders.
And the point I was trying to make was, if you made a case for Walter Payton at number 1, I wouldn't laugh you out of the room. I'd hear you out. Number 1 and number 2 were very obvious for me. I also have Barry Sanders at number 2.
So just to run down the numbers for Sanders, 10 Pro Bowls, that's every season of his career, 6 All-Pros, an MVP, 2-time Offensive Player of the Year. His 15,269 rushing yards is 3rd all-time. Keep in mind he only played 10 seasons. 99 touchdowns is 10th. 5 yards per carry is 5th all-time among running backs and 2nd of anyone on this list, only to the one guy we have above him. 99.8 yards per game is 3rd all-time, and it's 2nd if you take out Ezekiel Elliott, who's only been around for a few years. 4-time league leader in yards, 1-time touchdown leader, and this is an average Barry Sanders season for his entire career. 1,527 yards, 9.9 touchdowns, and 5 yards per carry. He was the best running back in the league for his entire career.
I couldn't agree more. Barry Sanders was unreal, and I honestly thought about putting him number 1. It's just because he retired after that 10th season, in my opinion, that you couldn't put him number 1. And if you want to argue the Adrian Peterson aspect, I think the Barry Sanders one, and he had no help around him, is a little more compelling. Listen to his quarterbacks. Rodney Peete, Andre Ware, Eric Kramer, Scott Mitchell, Charlie Batch. Who's winning with that at quarterback?
LeBron.
Yeah. Sorry, my bad. LeBron at running back probably would go to the Super Bowl.
But I mean, in all seriousness, the raw talent is just so obvious. The efficiency as a runner, the fact that, I mean, his average numbers for his career I gave you. An average Barry Sanders season is over 1,500 yards and 10 touchdowns on 5 yards per carry.
It's sad that he never had that team success, and it's sad that
But see, I don't hold it against him because he's at the end of the day, he's a running back. And there's only so much you can do on the football field when you're one of 22 guys.
Well, you saw what he did. He was unreal every time he stepped on the field. And I just wish that he loved the game just a little bit more to stick around, because the Lions, man, they've hit the nail on the head about 2 times every 10 years with a guy like Calvin Johnson Jr. and Barry Sanders. And for you to suck so bad that your guy just says, yeah, I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore. It really stinks.
At the same time, though, there is something about, as we see with these top 2 guys, being the best running back in the league for your entire career. They are the only 2 guys who can say that, and they're 2 guys at the top, and they're 2 guys who didn't have particularly long careers.
Barry played 10 years in his 3rd all-time in rushing yards.
No.
That is a testament.
Unbelievable.
And you know what? Number 1 in all-time negative yardage. And he's still 3rd all-time in 10 years. That's insane.
Yeah. Are we ready to move on to number 1?
Your number 1 running back of all time is, no surprise here, it's Le'Veon Bell.
It's absolutely Le'Veon Bell. You look at what he's done with the Jets, and it just really blows your mind.
He only fumbled once in 2 games.
Only fumbled once in 2 games.
And if you're like almost winning with Sam Darnold, that's pretty impressive.
And then Trevor Siemian, and then Luke Falk.
Luke?
Washington State quarterbacks are making their impact in the league.
All right.
But in all seriousness, it is Jim Brown. Jim Brown was a 9-time Pro Bowler. That's every year of his career. 8 All-Pro appearances. That's just like a joke. 1 NFL championship. 3 MVPs. 12,312 yards is 11th all-time. And that's in 9 seasons, half of which were 12 games and the other half which were 14 games. 106 touchdowns is 6th. 5.2 yards per carry is 3rd among all running backs and 1st of anyone on this list. 104 yards per game is 1st all time by far. Also had 2,500 receiving yards and 20 touchdowns there. He was an 8-time league leader in rushing, again in 9 seasons, and a 5-time league leader in touchdowns. He had 7 seasons averaging 100 or more yards per game, and his average career numbers, if he had played a 16-game season, and I understand it's not perfect, but you get the idea here, would be 1,669 yards, 14.4 touchdowns, and 5.2 yards per carry. That is absolutely unmatched.
My favorite stat for Jim Brown is he had 7,000-yard seasons. The only other 2, he was short by 58 yards in 4 yards. If he gets those 58 and he gets those 4, he has his entire career, he has 1,000 yards rushing every single year.
And in short seasons.
12 and 14 game. If he had 16 game, he would have done it. And 9 seasons, he won 3 MVPs and led the league in rushing 8 times. An unconscious running back, and unquestionably, in my opinion, we heard Herm Edwards say it earlier tonight, the greatest, in his opinion, I believe he said
greatest football player ever.
He said greatest football player of all time. I think that's debatable. What's not debatable, in my opinion, is he is the greatest running back of all time.
Yeah, I really don't think it's debatable either. He's just like, if you're talking about Sanders, they have a similar case of just absolute efficiency and brilliance from the moment they stepped on the field to the moment they left it. Brown was just a little better at it.
And the cherry on top, he's a 1-time NFL champion.
That's correct. And the 3 MVPs, obviously no other running back has more than 1.
Even more fun might be the honorable mentions.
Yes, some very good honorable mentions. Who do you have first for us?
Now, I honestly, after looking at the numbers and really researching this hard and long, the top 10 to me was pretty obvious who you should have in your top 10. Earl Campbell was the last guy added to my list, of course, at number 10. The guy I really struggled with to put there is Marcus Allen, and it's just his peak just wasn't there. A Hall of Famer, 12,243 yards, 14th all-time, 123 touchdowns, 3rd all-time, a 6-time Pro Bowler, a 2-time All-Pro selection, an MVP winner that I left off my list. He won the MVP in 1985. Only 3 1,000-yard seasons in 16 seasons. That's why he didn't make my list. He led the league in rushing 1 time. And it's hard to count against a Super Bowl champion and an MVP. The peak just isn't there.
Well, I kind of feel, yes. I feel like the peak for that 1 season was there. That MVP season, Marcus Allen was outstanding, but only 3,000-yard rushing seasons for his career, if I'm not mistaken, and that doesn't quite cut it for me. My first guy is Terrell Davis, an extremely short career, 3 Pro Bowls, 3 All-Pro appearances, 2 Super Bowls, an MVP, 2 Offensive Player of the Year awards, and a Super Bowl MVP. He was a 1-time league leader in yards, a 2-time league leader in touchdowns, and a 1-time league leader in yard per carry. And the first 4 years of his career, he averaged over 1,600 yards, 14 touchdowns, and 4.8 yards per carry. And in the playoffs, his playoff numbers, actually, if he had played a few more years, would be the best of all time by far. 8 games, 12 touchdowns, 142.5 yards per game.
Yeah, I really wanted to put Terrell Davis on my list when I was compiling my list. I said, where is Terrell Davis going to be? A 2,000-yard season, an MVP, Super Bowls, Super Bowl MVP. It's just a shame his career didn't last longer. I don't remember. Why did he retire? Was it the migraines? What was the reason?
I think so.
Yeah, really tough. I really like Terrell Davis, an all-time great. My guy next is John Riggins. And I thought about putting Riggo on my list, a Hall of Famer, 11,352 yards, 19th all-time, 104 touchdowns, 7th all-time, only one Pro Bowl, only one All-Pro appearance. And if you were going to put Riggo on your list, it would have to be for his performance in the Super Bowl that he won, is Super Bowl 17, and he was the MVP of the Super Bowl. It's really weird. John Riggins had a strange career. He really didn't, he was good and he was bad. And not bad. He was an okay running back. And then at the end of the season, at the end of his career, he really picked it back up again in Washington. 5,000-yard seasons in 15 seasons. Riggins, that iconic run against the Miami Dolphins in Super Bowl 17. I really wanted to put him on the list. Just couldn't make it work.
Well, and if I'm not mistaken, Riggins had like a 24 rushing touchdown season in like the second or third to last year of his career. So a weird career, some ups and downs, but definitely some brilliant football. The next guy I have is Sean Alexander, another guy whose peak was not long, but was absolutely brilliant. 3 Pro Bowls, an All-Pro, and an MVP. He's 9,453 rushing yards, is 36th all-time, but his 76.9 yards per game is 22nd. 100 touchdowns is still 8th all-time. 4.3 yards per carry. He led the league in rushing yards once, rushing touchdowns twice in that 2005 season, that MVP season. 1,880 yards, 11th best ever in a single season. 27 touchdowns, tied for the second best ever in a single season. 5 straight years with at least 1,175 yards and 14 touchdowns. And over his 5-year prime, 1,501 yards as an average, along with 17.4 rushing touchdowns.
For lack of a better term, Sean Alexander was that dude.
Yeah, and that guy.
Alexander, it was such a shame to see after Super Bowl 40 him blow out his knee. And I think we touched on this a little bit before.
We did.
Man, Alexander was good.
Yeah. Who do you have next?
My next guy, very near and dear to my heart. Love him to death. The Bus, Jerome Bettis. Maybe and possibly the last great nickname in football, the Bus. Hall of Famer, 13,662 yards, 7th all-time, and 91 touchdowns, 11th all-time. It's really hard to count against the Bus if you're just going off all-time numbers. His peak wasn't as high as some of the other guys on the list. A 6-time Pro Bowler, a 2-time All-Pro selection, a Super Bowl champ in Super Bowl 40, 8 1,000-yard seasons in 13 career seasons. Jerome Bettis was traded to Pittsburgh on draft night from the St. Louis Rams, or they might have been the Los Angeles Rams at that point, if I'm not mistaken. He had 673 yards in that last year with the Rams, and everybody said he was done. And he goes to Pittsburgh, he gets his career resurrected, gets that Super Bowl championship in Detroit, retires. Really hated leaving Jerome off my list. Again, I just couldn't fit him in there.
Yeah, I have another Pittsburgh Steeler up next for you, Franco Harris. The only one of my honorable mentions without an MVP, which tells you a lot about how great the running back position has been in NFL history. 9 Pro Bowl appearances, an All-Pro, 4-time Super Bowl champion, and a 1974 Super Bowl MVP. 12,120 yards in his career is 15th. 91 touchdowns is 11th. Only 4.1 yards per carry, but a one-time league leader in rushing yards. Had 8 1,000-yard seasons, and in the playoffs, 19 games, 1,556 yards is second all-time. 16 touchdowns is also tied for second all-time, and 81.9 yards per game in the postseason. An all-time great winner, had the longevity, had the postseason numbers, did not quite have the peak of some of the other guys, though.
I agree, and I think the 4 Super Bowls maybe inflate Franco a little higher to where some other guys are.
Yeah.
But Franco was also that dude.
And that guy.
I didn't really know how to rank this guy. I really didn't. Curtis Martin is my next honorable mention. I don't know what to say because his all-time numbers really look like he should be on here. Hall of Famer, 14,101 yards, 5th all-time in rushing yards. Those 14,000 yards in 11 seasons. 90 touchdowns, 13th all-time, 5-time Pro Bowler, a 1-time All-Pro selection, 10 straight 1,000-yard seasons. His only non-1,000-yard season was his last. He was never the best back in football, but consistent. I just don't think he had the peak to make my list, or he didn't have the postseason success either.
Yeah, so the last guy that I have for us, I'm very happy to be ending it on this note with a Buffalo Bill, Thurman Thomas. a 5-time Pro Bowler, 2-time All-Pro, an MVP, 12,074 yards, is 16th all-time, and 65 touchdowns, 4,458 receiving yards, and 23 receiving touchdowns. He was a 4-time league leader in scrimmage yards, had 9 1,000-yard seasons, and in the playoffs, 21 games, 1,442 yards, is 3rd all-time, and 16 touchdowns, is tied for 2nd with Franco Harris, who we just talked about. Thurman, of course, had that MVP, was the engine that made that K-Gun offense one of the greatest offenses of all time go. A very underrated receiving back. Only had the 5 Pro Bowls and the 2 All-Pro, but does have the MVP in his 16th all-time in rushing yards. To me, just an all-time great player.
And probably a guy you forget about that won an MVP.
Absolutely. Absolutely forgotten, I think.
And I think maybe forgotten in that offense.
He was the best player in that offense.
And I'm just saying that just because how prolific Jim Kelly and Andre Reed were.
Yeah, absolutely.
And you know where I'm going.
Yeah, of course, our old friend Spencer would. Oh, is that not where you were going?
No,
I thought you were going to say our old friend Spencer would take Andre Reed over all of them.
No, I was just going to say he never got the Super Bowl, man. That's really sad.
Okay, wow. I think on that note, we'll end on a very...
No. I want to mention a few other guys.
Okay,
I didn't even have time for honorable mentions for some of these guys crossed through my head when
some people say
I was
4
making
Super
the
Bowls
list.
deserves an honorable mention Super Bowl. He could give us 1. We'll take it. We'll take it now. No one will remember.
Gale Sayers, Ricky Waters, Tony Dorsett, Frank Gore, Marshawn Lynch, Herschel Walker, Roger Craig. Just to name a few guys that didn't even get an honorable mention, and they were all-time talents.
And we are also coming up right now with a great crop of young running backs, the best that I think the league has seen in about a decade. Since, as you mentioned earlier, the Alexander, Holmes, Tomlinson era, this could be the equivalent of that era, but of course with more of an emphasis on receiving.
It's weird to me because when I was growing up, it was, some teams don't have a running back, some teams don't have a quarterback. And if you look around the league now, it looks like every team has a quarterback to build around, maybe not the Dolphins, the Buccaneers.
Well, maybe the Dolphins. I like Josh Rosen.
I like Josh Rosen too, but they're going to take Tua.
I know. Well, I believe in that as well.
Anyway, every team you look at has a talented running back to go to, other than the Buccaneers. But even the Dolphins, they have Kenyon Drake.
Peyton Barber had a good week for the Bucs.
Okay, well.
And Kalen Ballage for the Dolphins.
Well, I'm just saying that every team.
Go Devils.
You can look at any team in the NFL today, and they have a talented running back and a talented quarterback somewhere on that roster, and it's scary. It's scary how good these players are getting.
Yeah, all right. I think that's going to wrap us up.
I agree. I've been Logan Camden.
I've been Carson Breber.
And this has been Nerd Sesh.